Grieve leads a global community that creates IT solutions to improve people's healthcare. He's the father of FHIR. He architected healthcare's best shot at data interoperability when he founded HL7's Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, as many of you know is called FHIR, the leading healthcare data exchange standard. At HL7, Grahame's responsible for the growth and governance of the community that develops the FHIR specification. He travels around the world physically now, again, and virtually to advise governments, vendors, and care providers about all aspects of interoperability. He was on the list of 15 health IT standards and interoperability rock stars to know, and has won many awards for his contributions to the digital health community. Bryn Rhodes is currently the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Alphora. He's a co-chair of the HL7 Clinical Decision Support Work Group and editor of the HL7 Clinical Quality Language and the FHIR Clinical Reasoning Module. With over 25 years of experience in the development and architecture of information systems, Bryn is currently involved with numerous initiatives to develop and implement standards related to interoperable and computable clinical knowledge. And so we really look forward to your talk.
Hey everybody, thank you for having us. I'm Grahame Grieve, I'm the FHIR Product Director, and with me I have Bryn.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I'm Bryn Rhodes, CTO of Alphora.
And thank you for joining us. We'll tell you about how to share computable knowledge with FHIR. So we're going to start by telling you about FHIR. So FHIR stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperable Resources. It doesn't matter what it stands for. It's a meaningless acronym that we chose so we could use it. And it's brought to you by HL7, which is an international standards development organization through which Bryn and I work with a very large community of people. I'm going to tell you first about FHIR, and then Bryn will dive into the details around sharing computable knowledge. So FHIR is using the web for healthcare. For me, it's an open community that is dedicated to making it easier to exchange healthcare information. It's open community, anybody can join, there's no membership requirements, and we meet through web infrastructure, social media and so forth. It's led by HL7, which means we're deeply connected to the worldwide health community. And it's first in a community, and the community takes on healthcare related problems, figures out how to share data to support those healthcare challenges, and then publishes, as a result of our deliberations and arguments, an open standard which describes how to exchange healthcare information. That's a public domain, free to use specification at hl7.org/FHIR, which describes a web API. We use the web standards wherever possible, and at the same time, it has continuity with existing healthcare standards, so the existing data can be brought forward. So I created FHIR as just myself 10 years ago, but a huge community's got on board. There's thousands of us now working on FHIR, and we did that because healthcare has broken processes. Other industries have been transformed, and IT enables that transformation. But the process, well, I wrote this slide a long time ago, was not happening in healthcare. It is happening, but it's got a long way to go. And partly that was because the IT standards didn't exist. IT wasn't implemented. But IT is not the answer. It's just a blocker to the answer. And the answer to the problems lie elsewhere: culture, business process, liability, but the business is slow. And so we wanted to move IT along so that other people could solve the problems they need to solve. And so really FHIR just exists to serve other parts of healthcare. I said it was a healthcare API, so it's a list of operations that other programs can use, a program can offer them. So we talk, how does a program actually invoke those operations, tech details that we look after? And then what kind of operations can you invoke? And what we do is describe operations that can be used remotely across the internet safely, and then the map to healthcare services. What's the patient? Where's their lab reports? Can I prescribe a medication for them? What medication, what treatment would you recommend based on the information you have about the patient? And then those IT functions get integrated into human level workflow and actually starts offering healthcare services. And that's how FHIR works. And some of the things FHIR does are really, really simple things like, as shown here, patient management or clinical management, but we're extending them beyond to talk about why are you treating the patient like that? What is going on in the background? What does the evidence say? And that's where the sharing clinical knowledge comes into it. But because it's a common framework across the picture, there's this continuity between connecting up this patient with all patients with clinical evidence. It's freely available. So published through hl7.org/FHIR under Creative Commons Public Domain license, which means you can do pretty much everything you want without needing any permission, because it's a standard. That's what we want you to do with it. We want you to use it for whatever you want to do. HL7 waived its rights around the content. We do protect the trademark so that we have the right to say what FHIR is, but you can do whatever you want with it in terms of use and restrictions. And in that sense, it's fair. I do need to tell you that although I love FHIR very much, it's my baby. It's the best thing well, other than my actual kids, it's the best thing I've ever done. FHIR is not a silver bullet. It's a nice technology that explains how to do things in healthcare. But we can only put things in FHIR if everybody in the world agrees to them. And there's not much that everyone in the world will agree to. What you need to do on top of that is find smaller communities, either countries or particular domains or particular institutions. And as you get to a smaller community with more commonality amongst the community, you can agree about more. And so basically you build layers on top of that, layers of agreement until you get everything you need to agree to. In some fantasy, we could get everybody in the world together and they would all agree on a common language. Well, it's not going to happen. So we have to live with this. And also some of the stuff we're working on, it's really new, particularly stuff Bryn's going to tell you about. And we're still learning what it means to do this well. And so it's not a silver platter that solves everything. It's work in progress. It's a huge step up for everybody, but it is not the answer. I just wanted to warn you all about that. What we set out to do was to transform healthcare, and we wanted to transform healthcare by transforming healthcare IT. I said we wanted to reduce the cost of interoperability by 90%. People laughed at me, but we did it. Some parts of things that people are doing now are 10% of the price because of just the commoditization that we've introduced. And for me, that leads to more outcomes for the same investment. The transformation that we want is starting to become evident, but it's far from complete. But for me, if you get money, if you get benefit from the investment you make, you're going to make more investment. And so that was our goal, is to create a positive feedback loop between creating interoperability, allowing data to flow, and getting clinical and business benefits from doing that, that actually increase the interest in sharing data flowing. I do always warn, and I've already said this, but I'll say it again, change isn't driven by IT because data is worthless by itself. IT is just an enabler, and it's to clinical champions. For me, one of the key things that we're taking on in the FHIR space, although we obviously have a focus on clinical records, exchanging clinical data by itself is meaningless unless you understand the context of the data and why in the context of the treatment. And that brings us to the clinical knowledge that Bryn is going to talk about. But we set out to be disruptive, not in the stock market sense. I don't care who makes money and who doesn't. Everybody who provides healthcare needs to be paid. We set out to be disruptive to the business of providing, to the process of providing healthcare, to make for better care coordination and better care management. So now I'm going to hand over to Bryn to talk about knowledge representation. And for me, this is a key part of what we're doing in FHIR to close the loop between what we know about medicine and what we know about the patient. Over to you, Bryn.
All right, thank you, Grahame. So we start in in looking at this and the approach that we've taken to this in FHIR, we're looking at the quality improvement ecosystem and all the different stakeholders involved. So looking at research and analyzing what's happening, the professional societies and organizations that produce clinical practice guidelines from that research to say what should happen, turning that into clinical decision support, making that actually happen, looking at what happens in clinical care with the clinician and patient workflow directly, measurement and analytics, measuring what happened and whether those processes and practices were followed, and then reporting what happened through public health reporting agencies, and ultimately closing back to research. Ideally, this produces a continuous improvement cycle. So lots of data is being exchanged at all of these different points, and FHIR can help enable that exchange. But there's also not only the exchange of data, but the exchange of knowledge around these different points. And if we can reduce the impedance mismatch between not only the sharing of data, but the sharing of knowledge, then we can improve that continuous cycle or enable it. So each of these boxes represents a specification or set of specifications that are being worked on by different work groups around HL7 that are directly related to this problem. In the middle, you have kind of the core enabling standards, mostly related to data model and the underlying sharing of that content. And then at each point, you have things like EBM on FHIR that's looking at standardizing how we share evidence, CPGIG that's looking at how we computably represent clinical practice guidelines, CDS hooks that's looking at how we integrate that decision support into the point of care, quality measure IG that's looking at how we distribute and evaluate quality measures. And in the public health space, you have MedMorph and ECR that are looking at enabling quality reporting. And these are just a few of the specifications that are being worked on, but they're directly related to knowledge representation and sharing. So I kind of take a step back here and ask why. As Grahame was alluding to, we want to help reduce the development effort required for clinical systems to support evolving standards of care. That's a fairly non-controversial statement, but it's also a huge problem that spans the kind of the breadth of health IT. There's a whole bunch of problems associated with that. So we can focus a little bit more and try to remove some of the barriers to that by enabling precise and unambiguous sharing of clinical knowledge. Just like FHIR as a data exchange platform focuses on sharing data, we can also use it to share clinical knowledge. The way we look at that in FHIR, look at types of interoperability. So on a spectrum from data to knowledge interoperability, there are different kinds of interoperability within that. And this is a continuum. They're typically not discrete, but as you get further down this continuum, you get more and more into knowledge sharing. So lexical interoperability means we're sharing the same symbols. We're using the same alphabet. Syntactic interoperability means we're organizing those symbols in the same way. Semantic interoperability means that on both sides of the exchange, we understand those values to be the same for the structures that we're using, for the elements of the structures. And that's where we actually start to get into knowledge interoperability. So we're not only sharing the data, but we're sharing knowledge. Logical interoperability then builds on that semantic interoperability to give us the ability to say expressions. I can start to share behavior. And then process interoperability builds further on that. And each of these are building on each other. You can't get to syntactic without lexical and semantic without syntactic and so on. So FHIR as a exchange platform really is the what's enabling all of this interoperability. So as Grahame noted, it's fast healthcare interoperability resources. The resources are the building blocks. They provide the syntax, if you will. Profiles then are conformance constraints around the use of those resources, usage descriptions, and they provide semantics for a given point-to-point exchange. The semantics on both sides are described by profiles. And it's also a protocol that defines interactions. So what kinds of things you can do with those data on both sides. And it's made up of several different modules. Foundation describes the base protocol. Conformance describes how you conform the constraints on both sides of those. Administration, so things like encounters and patients and organizations, and then clinical medications and observations, the actual clinical data. And then there's a module called reasoning that allows you to describe behaviors and content such as decision support rules and quality measures. So if we look at how we share logic, we break down along those a lot of the same axes as the interoperability. The logic can talk about model and it can talk about terms, but we explicitly separate those so that we can keep the model evolving and the terms evolving and can keep up with all of the different sources of that information. Another framework that we use in this approach is the knowledge representation levels. We categorize these as it's an approach to describing how structured knowledge is. So L1 is narrative. That might be a guideline that's written in a peer-reviewed journal article. L2 is semi-structured, so that's getting closer to structured, but still not computer readable generally. Flow diagrams, decision trees, other similar formats. Starting to get structured information, but still not completely structured. L3 is structured, so that's, we think, a standards compliant specification encoding logic with data models, terminologies and code sets, value sets. This is ready to be implemented, but importantly, it's platform independent. So it's computer machine readable, it's unambiguous, but it's not in any particular platform. And then finally, L4 is executable. So this is actual running code that's platform specific and running in a particular environment. And the reason this is important is oftentimes content is developed straight from L1 to L4. And developers and healthcare institutions have to go straight from a peer-reviewed journal article to executable content. And so we think that by providing some structured representations along the way, we can help lots more people get to executable more easily. So if you take those levels of knowledge representation, you plot them against the kind of standard 3 tiers of development architecture. At each of those intersections, you get different manifestations. So L1 narrative form might be a paper form or a user story. But in the L4 space, that forms layer is an actual running user interface. So in FHIR, we have representations for L3 content at each of these points. So in forms level, we have questionnaires, and in logic level, we have libraries and activity definitions and plan definitions, and so on, so that we enable development of content from L1 to L2 to L3 and ultimately L4 using FHIR representations. And there's some key interoperability resources throughout those points, and highlighting back to the separation between logic, model, and terms. The model resources that we care about in FHIR are structure definition and structure map. The semantics are terminology, that's code system, value set, concept map. And then behavior, so knowledge and process, is library, questionnaire, activity definition, plan definition, and measure. And importantly, these are all just FHIR resources, so they can be shared in the same way that any FHIR resource can be shared. And that means that we can include those FHIR resources in FHIR implementation guides. So not only do we have that as a distribution mechanism, but as a way to provide guidance around how to use that. So this diagram is depicting kind of the landscape of implementation guides, where you have the base specifications that are enabling all this along the bottom. So FHIR and the 5 modules of FHIR, FHIR path, CQL, CDS hooks, and SMART that are enabling applications and use of and exchange of behavior. And then implementation guides that tell you how to use those modules to produce different behaviors. So DEQM to exchange the data involved in quality measures. QM quality measures to exchange quality measure specifications. SDC to say how to use questionnaires. Those are specification IGs, and the idea is they're enabling a broad set of use cases, and IGs would expect to conform to those, just like conformance to the base standard. Model IGs like International Patient Summary or US Core, these are typically across a broad realm, enabling a broad set of use cases, but focused on the information model to support that. And then we have content IGs that talk about or that actually share content like family planning guideline from WHO, or sexually transmitted infection, or antenatal care, the CDC's opioid prescribing guidelines. And these content IGs are collections of, again, FHIR resources, but FHIR resources that represent computable content, computable recommendations of guidelines, decision support rules, and quality measures, so that those can be distributed and more easily integrated. So here's an example. This is a colorectal cancer concepts. This is a simple example that's demonstrating sharing just colorectal cancer data elements between decision support rule for the USPSTF recommendation on colorectal cancer screening and a quality measure that looks at that same measure or that same recommendation. And what that means then is that these FHIR resources are also potentially available via API. So if you look around the ecosystem from authoring to publishing to evaluation, in the terminology space, we have terminology services. There are lots of them. For example, in the US, there's the Value Set Authority Center. There are lots of national terminology services, and more and more are becoming available that use FHIR as the base for distributing terminology. In the same way, we see knowledge repositories popping up. So CDS Connect is one here in the US as well. The idea is that in the same way that terminology can be freely shared via services, knowledge repositories can make computable representation of content freely available. And the authoring groups like guideline development, measure developers, decision support authors can take advantage of those services and expose their content to the evaluation side. So smart apps and EHRs that need that content. So using FHIR enables that services approach as well. And a knowledge repository that supports that might look like something like this, a knowledge artifact management. It needs to engage artifact lifecycle. It needs to support artifact identity, versioning, operations and capabilities, supporting everything from authoring to distribution of that content. And so there are, for example, some capability statements in some IGs that we've developed that look at formalizing that set of operations that needs to be available for knowledge repositories. And as Grahame said, this is a work in progress, and so encourage feedback on that, that content. And finally, from the evaluation perspective, what this means is that I have packages of computable content that I can share around And with an implementation that completely understands that content, I can actually just deliver a service-based integration via CDS hooks of new content by just posting a bundle to a server. That's glossing over a lot of really important details that we've been working on for many years now. But that is possible today with CDS hooks enabled systems. And we're doing that in quite a few different places. So you use something like US Core to standardize the information that's available across that CDS hooks integration. You use CPGIG to say how the recommendation is structured. Use a clinical reasoning implementation that uses that plan definition and the CQL libraries that are providing the logic in there to expose that behavior via CDS hooks and return that as a CDS hooks response. So that's an example of a delivery vector that can be brought to bear when sharing content of this kind. And that is a high-level overview of sharing computable content with FHIR and where we are with that. So I'll turn it back to Grahame for a bit.
Thanks, Bryn. I wanted to tell you what drives us as a statement of values here. What Bryn and I and the rest of the team recognise is that currently institutions keep records and make policies for their own benefit. And we need institutions completely. But right now, as a balance thing, we need to empower patients and their carers to get their records into their own hands so they can drive care for themselves. And we need to provide them with consistent and coordinated care. And at the same time, we need to empower the care providers, nurses, doctors, physios, etc., to give them consistent systems that support them to provide care at the world standard, and at the same time based on evidence. And there's too much evidence; people can't keep up. So they need machine support for that now. But we need to make that empowers them, and that do it consistently across their practice scope. And for us, that's the ethos, is to empower individuals, both patients and carers. It's not that we don't like institutions, but institutions in the future world can no longer be a closed system where their accountability stops at their boundaries and their processes are all broken. And the work that we're doing to share patient records is got the political focus right now, but the work that Bryn's talking about around sharing knowledge about healthcare is critical to get this stuff sorted and right so that we can empower the individuals to provide that care. And so I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to tell you about it. And thanks for listening. Did you want to offer any more to this point, Bryn?
Yeah, the sharing of that knowledge is critical because it's currently just reproduced effort. It's currently being done, but as you said, there's too much evidence. Systems can't keep up. Institutions can't keep up. And no one environment or organization or institution is going to be able to deal with all of it. It requires coordination, it requires sharing, and it requires that we enable that sharing of knowledge on top of the data to get to actually improving the healthcare processes. So if you are so inclined and want to help us come solve this problem, here are lots of different ways you can get involved. Adapting clinical guidelines for the digital age is a CDC initiative. That's the initiative that produced the CPG on FHIR implementation guide. Clinical Quality Framework Initiative is a joint project between the Clinical Decision Support and Clinical Quality Information work groups at HL7. WHO has a Smart Guidelines initiative. EBM on FHIR has a COCA initiative. If you're interested in helping address the evidence sharing, there's a CQL on FHIR Zulip stream. The CQ Framework repository has a whole bunch of repositories and open source tooling and content. And the ECI Resource Center has a bunch of educational resources and tools about how we share behavior and computable representations with FHIR. So any additional thoughts on that, Grahame?
Yeah. So we'll work with the organisers to make sure you get the links behind those bullet points that Bryn's just shown. I just wanted to generally say that at this time, civil society is under assault from all sorts of sources, but the kind of work that we're doing here, building open source professional knowledge held by enduring institutional, open communities, it's what civil society is about. And so I encourage you all to get involved in one of these initiatives or other initiatives where you spend some of your time contributing to a bigger picture. A lot of you will be clinical professionals where that's a normal behavior, but if you're not, for me, it's critical to do that and to help build everybody's health by contributing to these kind of initiatives, whether it's with us or someone else. So thank you for listening and please get involved.
All right, fabulous. Thank you for that inspiring talk. We are happy to have Grahame and Bryn with us live here. So welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Excellent. Okay, we've got several questions from the audience. And the first thing I want to talk about, I want to start with FHIR, just as a data exchange standard. And, you said, Grahame, that everybody in the world needs to agree to use it. And so I just wondered, how is that coming? And there's been a big uptick in the uptake of FHIR. And did you foresee that? Is it tracking the way you hoped it would?
So everybody needs to agree to use it, but sometimes the governments agree and tells everybody to use it. And that process is gradually accelerating. For government projects, for national infrastructure, for even just for vendor products, you're talking a 10, 15-year life cycle development. And so some national programs synced up and were able to adopt it really early, while others, they're still running down on previous investment. And so it's gradually a sort of a step, everybody getting on board stepwise. But certainly around the world, more and more countries are saying our infrastructure is going to be FHIR-based. We're going to build out interoperability infrastructure, and then more and more projects are adopting it. Projects can adopt it without government involvement, and they are. And for me, some of the most exciting work that's happening now, since we've seen quite a bit of production work around exchanging patient records, is in public health research, clinical trials management, and this knowledge work that Bryn's been leading really well. Some of that stuff, there's a little bit in production, some very narrow use cases, big use cases with, US government departments. But for me, they're still very early days in seeing that unfold, and I'm really excited about that.
Thanks. Do you feel like it's got industry adoption as well as government and healthcare system adoption? Are they different drivers, or is everyone motivated by the same thing?
So, I mean, vendors and industry tends to be driven by ease of adoption, and the engineers pushing up from below saying, this makes sense to us compared to the other approaches. Can we just have this? And then those vendors make representations to the government. I haven't seen a government jump onto FHIR for some big architectural reasons without that push from the vendors. But I'm also seeing governments pushing at the existing system, saying, you need to move forward so that we can start thinking about the big picture. And so the ease of adoption and the alignment with the web and the availability of new tooling and so forth is what drives the interest for all parties. The real question is around deployment and process management. Those are hard things, and that's where we're seeing the struggle at the moment.
There's a lot of demand I see around me for developers of FHIR and not enough expertise. What do you think is needed to upskill the workforce?
That's a really great question. At the moment, when we engage with potential educational institutions or even with individuals, we tell them there's a huge demand for skills, and I get that. I have people writing to me 2 or 3 times a week indefinitely asking for skills people to work for them for some task or other. But when we talk to educational opportunities, people who want to learn, they're like, I'm not convinced that there'll be uptake of that, and I'm not convinced that it'll be worth my time learning that. I really don't know the answer. I'd really like to know how to encourage universities to offer FHIR specific courses. There are some, but there's not many. There's a huge absence, and I'm saying to companies at the moment, look, it's really better to skill your own people in-house. That's a difficult thing for a company to do, but it's your least worst option at the moment. And it's a market. I feel as though it's a market failure. How do we convince, from my point of view, learning healthcare IT as a developer and understanding interoperability is great for income. It's great for intellectual challenge. It maxes out on social justice. You can travel. How is it not the best job, right? And yet we can't convince people of this. So I feel as though first thing we should do is ditch the word informatics. Who knows what the heck that is, but I don't know what we should do beyond
that. So we need more developers of FHIR, but who else needs to learn about FHIR, and what do they need to learn? What are your thoughts about that, Bryn?
I think it's the question of the art of the possible. I think there's a lot of that can't be done. We just can't solve that problem. It's too hard. We tried that a while back and we can't figure it out. I think there's a lot of that, and I think FHIR really is different in that it presents the potential to solve a lot of those problems that maybe before really were insurmountable. I think it takes an approach. I think it takes lessons learned from the industry to apply them to healthcare, to really make that some of those really hard problems more tractable. And as far as who needs to know that, I think it's I don't know. I think they need to know that it's possible to solve, but I don't know who the they is.
Probably a lot of different layers of people who make decisions about it. Yeah, great. Okay, I want to channel Stan Huff right now. So Stan's a big fan of FHIR, but he has a concern that I've heard expressed over and over, and it's about semantic interoperability. Do you think there's a worry that with FHIR we can have syntactic interoperability but not semantic interoperability? And how big of a worry is that?
Just totally possible. Although, semantic is a really slippery word. From my point of view, semantic interoperability is what we're doing, talking to each other and understanding each other. You get computers to do the stuff that is, frozen and understood in advance. Is not semantics. But from a different perspective, what we're trying to do is get the computer to do semantics. Stuff that is understandable. So there's a whole perception question of what that means. It's certainly true that we've chosen to approach the problem from the bottom up in FHIR, and that means that people can start exchanging data that they don't fully understand, and they can come out of separate sub communities where they haven't agreed about the semantic basis for whatever that word means about what they're exchanging. And there's a different kind of world you could imagine where we can get agreement about all those things in advance, top down, and we don't have that problem of people doing things they're not really understanding. In some kind of fantasy world, the world that Stan wants to live in, and I'd love to as well, we could do all that stuff in advance. But I think Stan's work, which is wonderful work, and I like Stan a lot, demonstrates that we're not in that world. And you know, when I talk to Stan about that, I say, I really want to see that work that you're doing develop. But for us, it's better to get a baseline in place that you can build on, rather than try and build on that before the baseline's in place. So it's not so much, it's more a matter of which way do you want to get, what path do you want to take to that same endpoint, and where is the workable, feasible midpoints. And that's Stan and I kind of have this friendly, long-running, decade-long argument about which is the least worst option.
Well, and from my viewpoint, it's great to have working from bottom up and top down is always the right answer. You know, doing both at the same time and then working to bring them together. So, Bryn, a detailed question from an audience member. You describe a way to share knowledge unambiguously, but what if the knowledge is ambiguous or the data is incomplete?
So lots of different approaches to that. The first first piece of that we tried to put into place was the making sure that the missing information at the behavior level was at least representable, and that you would never assume that something was present if it wasn't, and that you would be able to say, I don't know, as the answer to a question, that's a valid response, and that systems that run this kind of behavior and logic need to be able to deal with that. And then the second is things like some of the core extensions in base FHIR that support saying why things aren't there. The data is not available, but you can also provide some nuance about why it's not available. The more of those different flavors that you try to handle, the more complex the logic becomes. And so we try to make sure that it's the balance between making sure you can represent the fact that the data is not present, but also get to that level of nuance if you really need it in your particular use case. There's also some really interesting work that's being done in the Arden space around the use of fuzzy logic. The latest Arden has complete support for fuzzy logic, which is something that I think could really be an important aspect. We don't support that in CQL at this point, but we do have support for a similar notion of uncertainty when you're talking about like date ranges and when you have partially specified information. So I think there's facilities, but you've got to take those things into account, and you have to go in eyes open.
Yeah, thanks. Another question from the audience: are there any examples you can share of guideline development organizations who are preparing or already producing clinical guideline content using CPG on FHIR and with related specs and approaches?
So there are several initiatives. WHO is in many ways furthest along. They have 5 or 6 different guideline groups in WHO currently working on producing or having produced CPG on FHIR content for antenatal care, family planning, and sexually transmitted infection. They're working on immunization and emergency childhood medical care right now. The CDC has done quite a bit, mostly focused on opioid representation. We see interest from cancer societies. ASCO has one out right now. There is a community projects page on the Clinical Quality Language Repository that tries to catalog as many of these things as we know about. So if you hear about more, please do report them and add them to the list. But yeah, we do see quite a bit of content becoming available.
Great. I want to return to your slide about open institutions, Grahame. And an audience member asked, how do we create the incentives and the culture to correspond to what's being discussed? Sharing saves lives, but how do we build the trust and the incentive structure to move it forward, given the capabilities being discussed now?
It's a great question. What the first and most important thing is for somebody to put their, reputation at stake and create the space and create an impetus in the space. That's probably most of what I did actually with FHIR was just create it. And then that gives people a choice to be able to do that. So what brings institutions on board is, a typical company or an institution or a university, you've got the things that you do that differentiate you from other people. You don't want to be bound to do those things the same. You've got things that you've got to do. Everyone's got to do them as part of their, professional obligations or their legal obligations. There's no value in doing that any differently to anybody else. Everybody's on board with doing that the standard way. And there's kind of this fuzzy space in the middle where people go, do we want to get on board with that? And for a hospital, say, let's take a hospital. When we first started working, well, let's take a vendor actually. When we first started working on this, vendors were like, yeah, standards, they hold us back because they wanted to differentiate. They were focused on their value proposition. But over time, in the last 15 years, we've seen vendors say, you know what? It doesn't bring us any value to not be able to share patient data. It just gets us into arguments with our customers. If we can share patient data, we can say, yeah, we can do that. And we can move on to things that actually create value for us, that create value for our customers. And you're seeing the hospitals make the same transition. When we first said, hospitals should share data, they were like, no, because that'll mean patients can move on. And now they've realized that'll mean that they can create workflows that work better for patients and for their staff, and that actually they can market. And so now they're not saying, oh, we have to hold on to our patient data and not share it. But nobody is going to take their business differentiator and say, oh, we'll open source that and accept standards and be bound to those. That's not going to happen. So the first thing is to understand is that you can't do that for your differentiator, but you can do that for everything else. And it's making the pitch at the decision-making level that opening the other levels makes it better for you to retain the best staff. And retaining staff is the single biggest challenge of any business. And so for me, retaining staff by being open and indulging in institutional professional development is a no-brainer. And what I've seen increasingly is that decision makers, C-level people who don't share, lose staff and lose market share and destroy their enterprise. And it's about making that case. But I think that increasingly that case is compelling.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to ask a final question. And it's really, you referred to getting records and knowledge into hands of patients. Does FHIR, how's it going on that? Are there a lot of use cases for that? How's FHIR being involved, and what's the next frontier?
So there's a limitless number of use cases for that, because if you want to give patient services, you need data. Most patients, it doesn't make any difference if they get their health data. They go, I'm sick. I know I'm sick. I don't need to know that anymore. But if they want services, you need data to build the services on. And so there's no limit to the number of use cases around coordinated care and care at home, seamless care transitions and medication management. We could go on. There's no limit of use cases. FHIR in some countries, in growing number of countries, is the middle of that. There is national programs to create infrastructures to get data into the hands of patients and then to allow services to be developed seamlessly. And some of those are in production, widely in production. You know, I think there's 15,000 endpoints registered on Apple Health now in the States. It's all FHIR-based to get data onto Apple, on your Apple iPhone. There's a long way to go to build out that ecosystem to where it could be, but they're at the moment predominantly focusing on getting the infrastructure in place. And other countries are not yet on board with that. Unfortunately, Australia is not on board with that. So I'd really like to see that change. But Australia is very much in the situation of, we want to control the services a patient can get. And it's really the control point that's switching in countries away from governmental or institutional control towards individual control. And that, for me, that's gives people the freedom to make better choices and to see healthcare that pivots around them rather than around the institution that provides it. But it's still, so it is in production in multiple countries, but it's still very much a work in progress across the world to see the full ecosystem that we can imagine unfold. We're just at the start of that journey.
Bryn, do you have any thoughts about that? Does FHIR need new additions or changes for these use cases for getting knowledge into patients' hands, data and knowledge?
I mean, FHIR, like with any kind of platform specification, right? It always needs something, and it will always need something. Like that's kind of the point. And one of the really important things that FHIR embraced from early on, right? Change is inevitable, and you have to make sure you can account for it. I just think the availability of that data in people's hands and the ability to share content, like if I in an institution and I can actually develop content that I could share with another institution because that data is available. That's, I think, where it's really going to start ballooning, right? So right now, if I'm at an institution, I develop a solution for a particular problem, can't share that. You know, there's no mechanism to do it. So opening that up, I think, is going to provide a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. All right. Well, Grahame and Bryn, it's been such a privilege to talk with you about this topic. It is disrupting the world, and just looking forward to everything that's coming next. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thank you.
All right. And now I'll hand it off to Philip. Oh, actually, we're going to take a few minutes because we are running early. And so I don't know, Philip and Chuck might want to have something to discuss before we move on to the lightning talks.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. I was kind of hoping Bryn and Grahame might still be with us to elaborate on that discussion. I see their faces in the background. I don't know if we can keep hold of them for just a second. So hi, Grahame and Bryn. Thank you for joining us. Hope you don't mind just lasting a few more minutes. There are some kind of developments that we wanted to put to you, that kind of, some of which arose from our earlier discussion. So I wanted to pick up on the discussion about education, workforce development, and Grahame, you were saying that universities don't seem to kind of see the value proposition for them in laying this on very generally. What I was wondering about is whether there's an argument for building on the kind of tutorial material Bryn was talking about, for example, the ECQI stuff. Also in the UK, we've done some level of development around CQL tutorials for some of the projects that we've worked on. And I was wondering about the possibility of linking it with things like professional body, continuing professional development, you know, where we're thinking about possibly linking it with clinical informatics certification, or for people who are maybe moving from a generalist computer science career into, as you well articulated, Grahame, the much more exciting and interesting world of healthcare IT. So do you see there's any possibility of kind of bringing these different things together? Because it's a real yawning gap, it seems to me, in generating this pipeline of people we need right now, let alone the ones we're going to need in a few years' time. Do you see any potential?
The University of Utah here in Utah actually has a really good informatics department, and they have a lot of coursework in FHIR. We're actually on the group that kind of tries to help contribute to that. And I think the biggest challenge is that it's really hard to produce good quality training content. And so there's there's a lack of it because it's so hard to build, and it takes a lot of effort, and that translates to either resources or labor of love. And there's only so much of that to go around. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to get that type of content more visibility, but I'm not sure what the best approach to doing that would be.
One of the challenges we have is that we as a community have valued greatly publishing a great deal of open source tutorial material. Really, we've worked really hard at that. And so there's a lot of medium quality tutorial material that's open Creative Commons. And that's really, really good. And it helps a set number of people to get to a set point. But it does actually erode the commercial value of doing really good training material and assembling it. And in some senses, it's a tragedy of the commons that we've achieved. I don't know if that was, I pushed it really hard and the community really got on board with that. And so that's really good. Maybe in the end, that's a bit of a challenge for us. We now have a new push coming out of HL7 to do more professional training and development work. I'm affiliated with Wendy's team, who are working with the government in Australia to produce some Australian-focused, high-quality tutorial material that has some real funding behind it, so that'll help. And there are other universities around the world doing good work, particularly Georgia Tech, and Heidelberg in Germany. But there's not a groundswell of motivation. And so I kind of think that it's kind of tracked between, we did open source stuff, which is good, but not great. And then it's really hard to connect the market together. There's definitely a desire, but also you need so many skills. This is one of the trouble. I've always thought that to do a healthcare IT well, you need to know clinical, you need to know IT, and you need to know management. And you need a lot of years under your belt to do that stuff, to know that stuff. And then you're not going to stop and go back out of your career and go back to being a student. And so a lot of what we do in the end is on the job training. And so that kind of handicaps universities as well.
Yeah, that's great. Really, thank you very much for staying on a few minutes just to address that. I would have liked to have taken it a bit further, but your helpful answers have taken us to time on this session. So that's great. So thank you very much again, Grahame and Bryn. And we look forward to having further discussions as we go forward with this. That's very helpful.